Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Vani and Reverend Dr. Jamie Mathias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jamie Mathias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
And for this episode, we're excited to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
I am so excited to do this podcast because our guest is someone who I just stumbled upon, Father Jamie, because I love Substack and I love clicking through to things. And our guest is Loren Richmond Jr. And I found his Substack a couple of days ago and I started reading through it. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is spot on. I think I sent you a message to that effect, Loren. And you know, one of the things we're doing with our podcast, as you well know, and as those who follow us know, is trying to bring interesting thinkers to the leadership, lay and ordained alike, of our movement. So Loren Richmond Jr. is a pastor. He's a hospital chaplain, and he's a nonprofit leader. He's the director of development and programming for Green Room Leaders. Love to hear more about that. And he is the co-founder and co-host of the Future Christian podcast. So many of us are looking for those podcasts where we're talking about new paradigms, trends, approaches. So that's one we all jot that down, and we'll give you contact at the end as well. His Substack, the one that grabbed me, is, I love this name, The Church Nerd. He's worked in multiple Christian traditions. He holds an MDiv from Phillips Seminary and an MBA in nonprofit management. Thus, his thinking about structure, organization, and future. I was excited when I saw that. He lives in Thornton, Colorado. He has a new book coming up called The Church as Community Hub. Very interesting and important approach, I think. So welcome, Loren. We're so delighted that you jumped in with us on our podcast. Is there anything I left out that you would like to add to your introduction so folks know who you are?
A big Yankees fan. That's about the only thing I can add.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got to sign off right now.
Yeah. At least we know what the tests of fellowship are. Yeah.
Okay, so I was born in the Bronx, so I should be more loyal.
Yeah.
But I have drank the Twins Kool-Aid, Loren. I have to tell you.
Yeah.
So,
you have been.
Loren, the Church Nerd and your work and Substack, which is just this incredible new world for us to dwell in. Tell us the things that are what you're doing, what's grabbing your attention, and we'll just get started talking.
Well, I suppose I should say, first of all, there's been, obviously, when we look over the horizon, so to speak, of the history of social media, there's some pluses and minuses of social media, but I'm in many ways I'm grateful for social media because I'm sort of a nobody in the grand scheme of things, and social media and Substack in particular and podcasting has really given me opportunity to share my perspectives in ways that I think I wouldn't have reach otherwise. So, there's certainly some negatives of this democratization, so to speak, of platforms and social media, but I am grateful in many ways for what it's given me an opportunity to share my thoughts. I like to read a lot. I like to think a lot, and Substack has given me an opportunity to share some of my thoughts and engage with people in really interesting ways.
So what are some of the topics that you've been engaging with? I know that Father Kathy Caimano was the link, so I have a son who is like the king of the Reddit thread, right? He will click and he, as a result, he has this astonishing knowledge base. He'll just keep learning. So
Yeah.
I actually found you through Father Kathy, and you were talking about ways to envision church and structure. And she had offered 3 ideas, and then you offered your thinking. So, let's talk about that, or anything else that you've been writing about lately that, you find of interest.
Well, gosh, we'll have to put some parameters on that for my own sake, so I don't overwhelm your audience because I tend to think about a lot. But I think, you mentioned like my MBA. I entered an MBA program in 2020 of all places at a time. So it was a nice like COVID project because I was really passionate about the future of the church. And I recognized like as an institution, the challenges and opportunities for church are, changing very drastically, I think, in our current culture. So I want to be better equipped to be to help guide and lead churches going forward. So uh, I really, I really try to bring that at recognizing like there are church and business are different institutions, different values, different philosophies, but also there is some wisdom and insights that churches can learn, I think, from a business approach in some regard.
Lauren, what an absolute delight to have you with us here on Cutting Edge Catholics podcast. We love having folks from other faith traditions, and I know that you describe yourself as a lowercase e evangelical. I'm wondering if you might be able to tell our listeners what that means to you and what it allows you to say about Christianity that the word evangelical sometimes makes difficult to hear today. It's interesting to have folks from other faith traditions coming to us, and so help us to sort of have some understanding of where you come from in terms of your faith perspective.
Well, I'll say that like the tradition in which I'm ordained, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, comes from a movement broadly referred to as the Restoration Movement or the Stone Campbell Movement, which was, interestingly enough, just about a week ago, celebrated sort of what is seen as like the anniversary of that sort of impetus event, which was what's called the Cane Ridge Revival, which was, if I remember correctly, August 8th, 1801, if I'm remembering correctly. So it was a very evangelistic movement and impetus in its founding and origins. Similarly, now I attend actually United Methodist Church, and certainly Methodism has historically been a very evangelistic movement and tradition. So traditionally, like evangelicalism within America was seen in a very lowercase e sort of philosophy, and it's only really in the last 50 or years or so that evangelicalism, sort of in an uppercase e, has become like a tradition, a movement in its own right. And certainly, I have some respect and appreciation for some of my colleagues and friends in the big E evangelical movement. I would I use the term lowercase e just to sort of avoid some of the political baggage that comes with the uppercase e, but also to try to express that I believe the gospel is good news and I want to share it.
Lauren, what comes to mind, I think, for many of our Catholic listeners when we hear the word evangelical is the uppercase E, evangelical. We
Yeah,
think, for instance, of when our U.S. president launched Operation Epic Fury, how he was surrounded for that photo op in the Oval Office by all sorts of uppercase E
yeah.
evangelical pastors, and we didn't see you as part of that photo op, to my knowledge. I'm just wondering what it is that this means, especially in terms of the progressive values and vision that Jesus of Nazareth seems to have espoused in my reading of the Gospels. I read of this very, very progressive spirit who who is not afraid to critique structures of power. And I think, Lauren, that's one of the things that really impresses me about you is you're willing to critique progressive Christianity from the left, as you say. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to just speak briefly about that to our listeners as well, because I just find that concept fascinating for us, especially within the Catholic tradition.
Well, I think it's just far too easy. Like it's so easy to critique the other side. Like it's just so easy. And I think like this is a cliche, right? But let's get our own house in order first. And certainly, broadly speaking, I would identify as someone within the Christian left, although probably very much center left now at this point. Um, but I think it's really important. Like, I mean, as Jesus said, right? Let's get the thorn out of our own eye before, or the mote I'm messing up the scripture here, but let's get the mote out of our own eye before we worry about the thorn in someone else's eye. Like we all have stuff to do, and I don't think, of course, like there's times I think we should say like this is not okay, but also like, and I think this is, forgive my biggie evangelical listeners, but sometimes it's just too easy. Like, try hard. You're like, you don't need to try that hard. So it's like picking on biggie evangelicals is sometimes too easy. So it's like, well, try something else. So try a new move besides picking on them because it's too easy.
Well, one of the things I know in my region of the country and in my past ministry experience is that, to their credit, the large evangelical churches, including the mega churches, have been in some ways more open to business models and business practices. So I went off to
Hmm.
Berkeley to work on a PhD on collaborative leadership
Mhm,
in the Roman Catholic system, because I noticed a dynamic where we had very empowered laity in many of our progressive Catholic settings
mhm,
that were leaders, but structurally they had no power whatsoever. So the
mhm,
role, for example, of a community council in a Roman Catholic church is, if you have it at all, because it is not required by canon law. Canon law only requires that a diocese have that group. But if you have that in a community, that body is purely consultative. They're not a decision-making body. And often, as I was leading a nonprofit in a very mobilized, progressive Roman Catholic setting, there was a collision between business leaders and what they wanted done, that what they thought were best practices, and what the ministry staff wanted to do. I
mhm,
remember I remember sitting in I was just arrived, so I have a business background before I went into ministry. Shut down my company, came to start this nonprofit, sitting in a big circle of people, and the council was there. We were talking about the next year, and one of the leaders on the council, who was also a board member of the nonprofit I was leading, said, "If we could give you $100,000 today, ministry leaders, what's that dream thing that you would love to do?"
mhm,
Not a single answer.
mhm.
Not
Wow.
a single answer. And I was like, "Are you?" I'm like, What?" I was in shock that people were thinking so small and so within their little box, right?
Mhm,
So, and yet, it's also not as simple as copy Grace Church, which is the big
mhm,
evangelical church here, and
mhm.
market the church the way they do.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that complexity? Like, I know you wrote a Substack post earlier in the week about, like, forget all this focus on marketing.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. We are all churches that need to grow. Some
Right.
of some of them are really teeny. They're practically house churches, and some of them are like the ones that are near you in Colorado and our
Mhm.
jurisdiction are pretty good size. What should we be thinking about and talking about in terms of that tension around business and church culture and the need to grow?
Well, there's several things. Let me try to respond to some of them here. First, you talk about sort of like polity, and this is certainly like a thing that is within my tradition, the Christian Church of Disciples of Christ. It's very congregational, polity based, so that the dynamic is often the inverse, where the pastor or the ministry staff carries the burden of responsibility but lacks much of the authority. So it's interesting you kind of talk about that inverse in your own tradition. So that can be a real challenge and disruption. So it's important to be aware of that. Just like, where is the authority, where is the responsibility? And if those two are not aligned, that can create tension and really like frustration. Like, this is where, again, I think sometimes business tools help us become more aware of these things. Certainly, there's been a fair amount of critique of evangelicals because of their almost sometimes too much adapting a corporate model. And folks like Eugene Peterson, the late Eugene Peterson, was one to critique that. So I think, again, everything has to be, for lack of a better word, understood with a bit of a grain of salt, recognizing like what is this a tool or is this like the full model? And I don't think like we don't necessarily want to become a business as a church. But similarly with marketing, like I think marketing tools can be great for churches because like uh, we're trying to I mean to some extent like we are trying to solve a problem in a church. I believe like has good news to share with people. It has, again, for lack of a better word, like a product that people want and need. So it makes sense that we would want to market and use some marketing tools. But also, like I remember when I was doing my MBA, I was thinking about specializing in marketing. And I remember reading this story about, I can't remember the name, but somebody who was doing marketing assistance for a company in Asia. And the company was like, how can we get kids to like coffee more? Because I guess in Asia or China, I can't remember, coffee was not a big part of their culture. So the guy was like, put coffee into chocolate that you sell to kids. And I was like, well, maybe I don't want to be then marketing that much then, because that seems like a little bit problematic. So again, like certainly there's some marketing perspectives and tools that would be, I think, against the ethics and ethos that we'd want to use as churches. So again, some discernment and wisdom is helpful.
Yeah, well, I think, one of my questions in the background is what is it that we're marketing?
Yeah. And I think
What
I
is
think
what
that's
is it that we're marketing?
this is a huge thing because I don't know if you read this post of mine, but I wrote a post about multiple bottom lines. And multiple bottom lines is often like a social entrepreneurship terminology. And I think the challenge can be in churches, in social entrepreneurships, when there are multiple bottom lines, it can be confusing to be like, what are we really about here? So, like for a business, even if they are intending to be a social entrepreneurship, like ultimately, they need to make money to stay in existence. So if what they're doing is consistently drawing them into the red, then something needs to adjust, even if it is a good thing. And similarly for churches, I think churches need to think like, what really is our ultimate bottom line here? Because we can have a lot of good things we're doing in the community, but if it's not serving our ultimate bottom line, or if we're not aware of what our ultimate bottom line is, then there's going to be some confliction or um, disagreement, perhaps.
What are
Lauren,
the what are those bottom lines for a church?
Well,
How
again,
could
I
you name
think,
those for us?
yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, like, I should ask you, right? Who is you have the ecclesiology degree, I don't. So you might be able to speak better than I could to this. But again, we could think about gospel proclamation. We could talk about evangelism. We could talk about social justice. We could talk about discipleship, Christian formation, community building. Like there could be multiple bottom lines. So I don't want to define for a church what their ultimate bottom line has to be. Like I think that's a ecclesiology question. I think that's a discernment question. But recognize that if you have two bottom lines of, let's say, community building and gospel proclamation, like one of those that at times they're going to conflict with one another. So you need to be aware of what your ultimate bottom line is.
Lauren, I absolutely love this image that you use of the chocolate, excuse me, the coffee in the chocolate.
Yeah.
Partly because when it comes to, because we who are in the church environment often think about, we wouldn't call it marketing per se, but how it is that we are putting ourselves out to the world and how it is that we're bringing folks in. The gospel analogy that comes to mind is throwing out the nets and seeing what fish can be
Hmm.
pulled into the boat. But what fascinates me, what as I hear you speak, what came to mind were memories in 2016. Our parish here at Holy Family in Austin now had additional clergy, so Father Roy and Father Cleophas Maria could stay at Holy Family and celebrate the Sunday masses, while Father Libardo and I could go out and do a study of the mega churches here in Texas, and it was fascinating to see essentially what experience these churches were offering that was really bringing people in right? That was bringing in these
Hmm.
incredible catches of fish, if you will, in
Yeah.
big, big ways. And we saw a lot of it boiled down to three essential elements of hospitality, that a
Hmm.
person really feels welcomed when they walk in the door, excellent preaching,
Hmm.
and also the experience of music and
Yeah.
worship was just something that in many Catholic communities that frankly were, with the ritual that we have in the Catholic tradition, we don't have the same spirit as what we saw. So just wondering, in light of all of that, if there is anything, especially because you mentioned proclamation, and the word that comes to me to mind when I hear you say that is the charisma of the church. That how
Hmm.
it is that this should be, this good news is the message.
Yeah.
And yet, so often as a church, instead of focusing on the charisma, we focus on this institution that we've built. And so it just seems like our focus is going in the wrong direction from the start. Thoughts that come
Yeah.
to mind as you hear some of those thoughts.
Well, one thing it's A.W. Tozer line that in recent years, Tozer, I think he was Baptist, not for sure what tradition he comes from, has like all of us some problematic um, sides, but I think this quote certainly is relevant. He said something like, "You win them to how you win them is how you keep them." If that makes sense, I'm saying it. You win them to what you win them with. I'm not saying it very well, but basically saying if you win them with uh, chocolate, like they're going to be formed in expecting chocolate. So I think that's the real challenge that we're seeing within some of these big churches that you speak about is, if we're winning them with a really compelling musical environment and production levels, like in some sense, you're training people in the idea that that is what Christianity and faith is about is big productions and compelling music. Not bad things per se, but I would argue, like I think that ultimately we want it's the gospel message that should be winning them over. Like you should be winning them over with the gospel message, and certainly like since the 80s or so in American many evangelical Christian traditions, the idea was a sort of seeker sensitive um, theme in church that we could sort of win them, we could kind of like trick them, I suppose, into faith. And I think there's some like sociological truth to that. Like there is this sort of like behave, believe, belong, that framework. If you've heard that framework, like there's some truth to this idea that like um, what we do forms us. And interesting, like that's a reason why I become more appreciative of high liturgical traditions because quite literally, in high liturgical traditions like your own, we are practicing the faith within our bodies in a way that's, I think, forming us and shaping our beliefs.
Well, it's interesting. As you were talking and Jamie was talking, I was transported back to the ministry I did with the Levin Center, which was kind of mobilizing, um, capturing data on what was happening in the most effective Vatican II realized Roman Catholic settings.
Hmm.
And here's like the classic tension I used to see. So this is the tension of like the gospel and the bottom line. These are the two bottom lines, right? So
Mm-hmm.
have an event, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how do we decide the event is successful?
Yeah.
So the event, I had one board member who was in my life, and I was just presided at his funeral a couple of months ago, who would have said the number of people in the seats and the money you have generated to offset the cost of that speaker is the measure of success. That's your bottom line, Trish.
Yeah.
And then Father Tim Power, my mentor, would say, but you know what? Even if 5 people
Yeah.
had their lights turned on and came closer to Christ, that's success. And
Yeah.
that was the thing that brought me to the PhD was the collision of
Yeah.
these two worldviews.
Yes.
Now,
Absolutely.
one of the things that we deal with, I think, in our movement is that we are very at the effect of the bottom lines of the church that's evolving, like the church that's preceding the church that's emerging, right? So,
Hmm.
what are bottom lines? We have really good faith formation. We have good preaching. We have a great experience at liturgy. We have good justice outreach. And we are drawing people in, we're growing. Like big is a measure, right? Big.
Mm-hmm.
And the first
Yeah.
person I saw kind of rebel against big was Doug Pagitt here in Minneapolis,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
Solomon's Porch in an old Episcopal church with all the couches all over. I remember going over there and experiencing it. Small. We're going to be small. So like part of it is like figuring out, well, what is that measure of success? Like I
Right.
think at Karis, we have probably 75 really committed members and another like 75, and these are all people all over the world because we have a hybrid liturgy. Well, what is that? Is that enough, Trish? Or is it got to be that it's this much revenue and you can pay this kind of salary and you can, right? So I'm
Well, I
struggling.
think,
I struggle with that. I really
yeah,
do.
I think again, this is where it's essential to be aware. Like you've probably heard the phrase where there's no margin, there's no mission. There's an Anglican priest I like to quote often that says something to the effect of, if a church is going to be a voice for social justice, it must first exist. So, I mean, there is that real tension of like, what is what is our ultimate value, and sometimes we might think about, I read about this guy in seminary, forget the first name, the Shanky principle or something to that effect. I'm blanking on the name. Shirky principle. This idea that the unstated ultimate aim of most all institutions is to sustain their own existence. And that again, if a church is explicit like that it is not our mission, then that can change their decision making and their values. But these are real tensions that need to be considered.
Lauren, I'm intrigued by the title of your forthcoming book. I know that on September the 8th, we're going to be seeing a book from you titled The Church as Community Hub, Sharing Spaces to Help Neighborhoods Thrive. I'm just thinking, imagining myself that we're in the middle of a change of paradigms when it comes to the church. We are trying to find ways to reimagine what it means to be the church and what it means for the physical spaces in which we worship. Many of us within the inclusive Catholic tradition find ourselves nesting within churches of other traditions who, because of dwindling attendance and
Hmm.
resources, are often quite excited to welcome us for the life and the energy that some of us bring to their facilities and to their churches. So I'm wondering if you might be able to tell us a bit about the changing paradigms that you see. I especially think about it in terms of, there are certain things about the church that just need to die. The
Hmm.
dwindling attendance should tell us something, and yet for many of us being part of a tradition and a structure, every system perfectly maintains itself and is resistant to change. And so we have these various it's a struggle always to get the church from one paradigm to another. But
Yeah.
as we imagine ourselves transitioning paradigms, tell us about the idea that you lift up of the church as a hub, and what it is that we, especially all of our listeners, are probably on the edges of their seat, thinking, wondering, what does this mean, and how is this something that we can take into our own communities and really make real?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the sociological paradigm. I just had a guest on my own podcast, Future Christian, who talked about the Sunday school movement. And I'm not sure how prevalent that was within Catholic context, but certainly in Protestant contexts, like the Sunday school movement, like he was mentioning that in his experience, and this was an older gentleman, that in his childhood, like Sunday school attendance was a bigger deal than worship attendance, if you could imagine that. And I remember actually serving as a pastor at a church that formed 115 years ago from a Sunday school movement. So in many ways, it was a bit of like a small group, to use that word broadly, but different sociological glue that were bringing people together and keeping them together, I guess is what I'm saying. So this is what I'm thinking about, like the old models of, putting up a sign and having a worship service with a big building. Like that's not drawing people in, unfortunately. I wish it would. Certainly I would encourage churches that are struggling, like, gosh, if I can be so bold, like maybe you need to get back to like preaching and teaching as if like what we have to offer actually is, you know, like, worthwhile for people, like the gospel matters. Like I think speaking of marketing, like if we say like you need this and should want this, like I think that's attractive in its own right. But I digress from that point. The reality is, though, because of demographic shifts and church attendance trends, like the reality is, like Jamie, the church that you're in that has a handful of people, like they're not going to become a mega church again overnight, barring something miraculous from God. And if the Spirit intervenes in that sense, like hallelujah, right? That being said, like I think the move is often from churches and denominations like, well, we've done what we can here. Let's just sell the building and cut our losses. And realistically, like especially in urban spaces, churches are very valuable real estate. And what often happens in urban spaces is churches become increasingly, as they're sold, become increasingly less accessible to the public. So if we're purely talking about church spaces as a public good, when they're sold, they become increasingly less available to the public. So again, I'm thinking of one church in my metro area was sold, became, you know, a pub, like so cliche, right? Became a pub. Well, you know, it's open to the public, sort of, right? But then it was sold again, and now, unsurprisingly, going to become high-end condos. So again, sort of open into the public, but again, less and less so. So I think the church's community hub, certainly, hopefully, everything I've made clear, uh, talked about, like emphasized, like I care deeply about the gospel and the proclamation of the gospel. But that being said, recognizing that our infrastructure, our buildings can serve the communities in much more ways than we might have previously imagined, and that real estate is valuable and worth hanging on to.
Lauren, many of our listeners too may be familiar with your your future Christian podcast. For those who
Hmm.
may not be familiar with it, tell us a bit about that podcast because I'm imagining that fits within this larger context of reimagining the church. You know, what is the future Christian? What does he, she, or they look like? What does the future church look like? And what are some of the conversations that y'all are having that might help to inform us within our own movement as well?
Yeah, well, I think in many ways we don't know what the future church and the future Christian looks like, but that's something that my co-host and I, Martha Tatarnik, who's an Anglican priest in Canada, we're very much interested in having, and because of that, like that engages in conversations around certainly church renewal, future church models, pastoral health, trends within church with authors, pastors, folks who are influencers and leaders within Christian traditions across North America. And I gotta confess, like I don't think I've actually ever had anybody Catholic on the podcast. So like that's an open missing element for me. But we talked again from Christian leaders across theological and denominational traditions, because I think there's a lot of wisdom and insights to be shared uh, and learn from other perspectives.
I do think we have so much to learn from each other. And I have to say that even as I did a lot of work with Leadership Network in Dallas, Texas during my years in the Levin Center. And I often thought, we each have something the other needs.
Hmm.
So in the evangelical world, I saw that focus on um, a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, a deep relationship with the gospel, a real outward looking focus, um, a real engagement with the scriptures as all
Hmm.
things that my evangelical brothers and sisters were really an ability to pray head to head
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
such a beautiful way. I remember praying for someone I love who was in a crisis while I was with these evangelical pastors, and I was moved to teary silence with the
Yeah.
fervor of their prayer. On the other hand,
Yeah.
what we hold is an incredible trajectory of social justice
Hmm.
tradition Catholic social teaching is magnificent for Christians. I think I heard a Unitarian extol it at one of our events,
Hmm.
right? Um, I love the beauty of liturgical prayer.
Hmm.
I love the deep traditions in Catholicism of mysticism and spiritual longing and awareness. So we have a lot to learn from one another. I mentioned that I found you through Father Kathy, and I'd love you to share a little bit about Substack Seminary. A lot of our folks are still looking for ongoing formation and developing themselves as leaders and ministers. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's about and how people would find it?
Yeah, Substack Samurai is just this little sort of thing that came about as a part of a conversation just like we're having right now about what does the future of the church look like and how can we help shape it more practically speaking. So Kathy and I somehow connected via the interwebs. I don't even remember at this point, but we're thinking about like there's a lot of changing dynamics and structures and church is complicated and we're not sure like the current methods and trends that are enough to work toward the future. So Substack Seminary is quite literally on Substack, and it's meant to be a sort of a training program, if you will, or offer some guidance and assistance for folks who are recognizing like the current models and methods aren't quite working and they've maybe not been trained or equipped to look into the future and offer some wisdom there. And as we often say, you're not weird, you're early.
Well, I love that affirmation because I've been feeling weird for quite a long while. I continue to feel weird, even within my own jurisdiction, as
Yeah.
Jamie knows. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, and my dear friend Jamie Mathias has been inspired by Stephen Colbert, and
Hmm.
he has developed something that we love to spring on our guests. So he's going to spring it on you, and you can pause. And if you don't have an answer, you can say, I don't know.
Okay.
So anyway, so do you want to introduce the questionnaire, Jamie?
Happily, Lauren, this is our Cutting Edge Catholics questionnaire, an opportunity for our listeners to be able to better know our guests through a set of rapid fire questions. So I'll simply ask 10 questions. You just say the first thing that comes to mind. How's that for a deal?
Okay.
This is the Cutting Edge Catholics podcast questionnaire, Progressive Christian, or if you prefer, Church Nerd Edition. Here we go. First question, Lauren. Coffee, tea, or something stronger?
Coffee.
Favorite Bible character who isn't Jesus?
I think I like Elijah comes to mind.
One theological opinion you've changed your mind about?
I mean, I feel like depending on the day, atonement theory.
If you could have dinner with any theologian, living or smiling down from heaven, who would it be?
Oh, I like this question because we ask a very similar question on my own podcast. Gosh, Karl Barth is coming to mind.
One thing every pastor should do every Monday morning.
Get out of bed. I used to say, and I don't mean this derogatively, but I used to say as a former church planner that I think the hardest thing about being a church planner was simply getting out of bed on a Monday morning, especially after a rough Sunday. So I think like at the most basic thing a leader can do, especially in our time of institutional decline, is just like get out of bed and put one foot in front of the other.
One Christian cliche you wish would disappear forever.
Gosh, it is funny, like based on which tradition you're in at the moment, like how you hear those cliches. Like I was just in some evangelical gatherings and I heard like love on and pour out. I was like, wow, I'm in a different tradition right now. Like love on to me, I thought like evangelicals got rid of that because they recognized it was kind of weird, but I guess not yet.
Yeah. Complete this sentence, Lauren. The Christian of the future will be.
I think the Christian of the future will be more grounded in practice, like uh, faith practices and formative practices like liturgical practices.
Final question, Lauren. Complete this sentence. The church will have a future if we.
I mean, I think the church will have a future regardless. Like I think that's the promise, right, of Christ and of Scripture. Um, I think the church will have a future. I think whether or not we're going to recognize it may be the challenge, right, or bear witness to that future. Like it's not an if, but I think it's a are we going to do our part and bear witness to that future?
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate your willingness to take our Cutting Edge Catholics questionnaire, Progressive Christian, or if you prefer, Church Nerd edition. Lauren, we've come to the time in our conversation where we typically think about some last words that we'd like to share with our listeners. So if you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then I'll kick it over to Reverend Trish, and then we'll allow you to have the final word here with us today. I just want to bow my head in your direction, Lauren, and say thank you for being with us today because I'm a forward thinking person myself, so I just really appreciate breathing in what it is that other forward thinking people are are thinking these days. And so when I hear of your forthcoming book on the church's community hub, and when I listen to your podcast on the Christians of the future, I just find what it is that you're saying and doing very inspiring. And as a church nerd myself, I just want to say hats off to you for all that you're doing to make the message of Jesus real in this world. There are so many of us within the church who are so focused on so many other things besides the gospel message that it's just really refreshing to have persons like yourself who continue to lift up that gospel message as a source of inspiration for our nation and for our world. Reverend Trish?
Well, I am filled with thoughts about how I want to carry this to my own community. And that's the sign to me that we're on to something important. And so I'm I'm really thrilled and I'm so grateful for your generosity, Lauren, to just say yes and jump in when you don't even know the two of us. And that I hope this is the beginning of a wonderful friendship. I also was very moved when you said, what was that last question, Jamie? It was like the church will continue if, all right.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
really what I heard you say is forget the if, put a period on the
Hmm.
church will continue, because I too believe that the Holy Spirit was breathed out upon the church and nothing will prevail against that. And it might end up looking nothing like what we think. And
Hmm.
sometimes I tease our community members who we have a number of younger people, but we have a lot of people my age and older is that, yeah, we might be hospice for Vatican II true believers. And that's okay. We're going to pray really well and we're going to live into whatever that future looks like with
Hmm.
faith and hopefully with joy, And so I value having that deep belief in me affirmed by a new brother in Christ. So I'm just really delighted. But you get to have the last word. So anything else you'd like to say before we close out our time together?
Yeah, I think I would like to just bring it back to sort of the beginning. We talked about sort of me claiming to be a lowercase e evangelical. And I think I would say this because it's sort of the mood or the tenor that I have try to have when I walk around the hospital and with some bit of enthusiasm, if I may, because I think ultimately I believe I have good news to share. And I think the gospel is good news. And uh like to remember that like the gospel is good news, and if you haven't encountered or been reminded of the radical gift of God's grace recently in your life, like find find a way you should connect and encounter that again. And because I think when we really encounter God's grace or are reminded of God's grace like in our lives, we want to share that. And that's I think that's why I claim to be an evangelical, if you will.
Thank you, Reverend Lauren Richmond of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We want to encourage all of our listeners to tune in for future Christian podcasts. You can also learn more about Lauren Richmond on Substack. And on September the 8th, we'll see his new book, The Church as Community Hub, Sharing Spaces to Help Neighborhoods Thrive by Church Publishing. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jamie Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan Vani.
Let's go forward boldly into the future.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.